I want to just introduce our two speakers. Habib Battah is the managing editor of the Beirut-based Middle East Broadcasters Journal. He has been in print and broadcast journalist for some of the Arab world's leading news organizations, including Al Jazeera, Lebanon's Daily Star newspaper, Beirut-based satellite channel, the Future Television. He's covered a range of political events from the Middle East, including the Iraq War and the turmoil in Lebanon recently. Our other speaker is John Sawyer, who was a colleague of mine for 31 years on the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. We worked together in the Washington Bureau. To the extent that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had a foreign correspondent, he was it. He claims to have been to 6 countries. I'd like to have seen you counting your countries, but we'll take his word for that. Since 2001, he's been focusing particularly on events in the Middle East, and the two of them were brought together last fall as part of an exchange that the Stanley Foundation sponsored, and folks from the Stanley Foundation are here to talk about their different perspectives on the Middle East and compare and contrast them. So today they're going to give us some presentations, and then we'll open it all up to questions from you all. John?
Good. Thank you, Bill. Thank you all for being here and for giving us the opportunity to speak. Let me introduce Lauren Keller and Sharif Habib from the Stanley Foundation, who are sitting over here. And it was the Stanley Foundation, which is based in Iowa, that sponsored, along with the Reuters Foundation, the week that we spent in Beirut last September. A dozen American journalists and Middle Eastern journalists to do a workshop and discuss our different approaches to coverage of the Middle East. And it was a fascinating experience for all of us, and I'm grateful to the Stanley Foundation for making it possible. One of the great things about that week in Beirut was that we spent time together not only in the classroom but also in the field doing actual reporting with Hezbollah commanders on the Israeli border, interviewing the head of Hamas in Lebanon, touring the Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. We learned a lot about the situation in Lebanon, and also about the biases and preconceptions that each of us brought to our reporting. The Middle East reporters believe very strongly that Israel and oil alone, for example, explain U.S. policy in the region. And they were surprised that their American counterparts thought that there were other factors at play. The Americans were just as surprised to discover that the Hamas and Hezbollah leaders we met were considerably more sophisticated and nuanced than the stereotypical terrorist they had expected to encounter. A lot of my own reporting over the past 5 years, as Bill said, has been in the Middle East and predominantly Muslim countries. And it's been a continuing education for me in how the American media so often gets it wrong, oversimplifying and misconstruing countries and peoples about whom we know far too little. I found that very much to be the case in the run-up to the war in Iraq, and more recently in reporting that I've done in countries like Iran, Afghanistan, and Sudan. I'm happy to discuss any of those topics, and I hope that you'll bring up areas of particular interest in the Q&A. I want to use a few minutes first to make some more general points about some of the negative trends in American journalism today, and how I hope to address them at a new center that we've just established in Washington called the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. Journalistically, the past 3 decades has seen a growing consolidation of media ownership, a decline in the number of independent newspapers and of multiple newspaper cities, the rise of the chains, and with them a precipitous drop in national and international reporting. On the other hand, there's been a fragmentation of the media market, the proliferation of lifestyle magazines, the advent of 100-channel cable television, online blogging, and the rise in more ideologically defined media, whether it's Fox News or NPR, depending on your point of view. Old line newspapers, shedding 3 to 4% of readers a year, for the most part, still strive for what they consider objectivity. And for them, the new environment has meant instead an increasingly desperate focus on packaging, sensationalism, and the so-called big story. Whether it's O.J. Simpson or Monica Lewinsky or Dick Cheney's misadventures hunting in Texas. There's been a relentless pressure beyond ideology for the simplification of complex stories, for easy demonization and caricature in place of context, a herd approach to presenting the news instead of a search for deeper truths that valued the presentation of independent and contending voices. Now, many of us saw the 9/11 attacks as a wake-up call, a stark reminder to the public and to us that we could not ignore the world beyond our shores, that we did so at our peril. Many newspapers around the country, including the Post-Dispatch, dramatically increased their budgets and space for foreign reporting. But the interest in foreign coverage diminished. It fell off nearly as quickly as it had arisen, not just at major regional papers like the Post-Dispatch, but at the networks, magazines, and bigger newspapers too. In the weeks before the 9/11 attacks, the American media had been consumed with shark attacks in Florida and the disappearance and murder of California housewife Lacey Peterson. And less than 5 years later, sensation and trivia rule once more. For all the furor last year over Dan Rather's botched report on President Bush's National Guard Service, say, or the New York Times mishandling of the Valerie Plum case, the bigger story, at least to me, was the continued decline in serious news coverage. There was a study that was released last week by the Project for Excellence in Journalism that toted up the dreary statistics, and among them the fact that newspapers nationwide have shed 7% of their staffs since 2000, a reduction of some 3,500 newsroom professionals. Something that I'm sure that the communication majors among us here are more aware of than I. Longtime CBS foreign correspondent Tom Fenton details these disheartening trends in his book Bad News that came out last year. He says that when he joined the network's Rome Bureau in 1970, he was one of 3 full-time correspondents for CBS in that city alone, and part of a CBS global presence that included 14 major foreign bureaus, 10 mini bureaus, and stringers in 44 countries working for CBS. Today, the entire network consists of 8 foreign correspondents and 3 bureaus. And 4 of the correspondents are based in London, where their job consists of doing voiceovers for videotape and wire reports that others have compiled. At the CBS of today, Fenton writes, they, quote, take it on trust. Don't shoot it, don't report it, just wrap it up and slap the CBS eye on it and hope that you won't notice the difference. In 2004, meanwhile, the 3 networks together devoted 1,174 minutes, nearly 20 full hours on the network evening news to missing women, all of them white. That was the coverage that they thought people were interested in getting. It's in opposition to such trends that we have established the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. And as many of you may know, the Pulitzer family owned the Post-Dispatch and other newspapers for 130 or so years. And the paper was sold last year to Lee Enterprises, an Iowa-based chain, part of the conglomeration mergers that I was talking about earlier. The center is an independent division of the Washington-based World Security Institute. It's created for the purpose of funding independent reporting on issues of global significance that have gone unreported, underreported, or misreported in the mainstream American media. We at the center, we pay for the reporters' travel. We help them place the work in newspapers and magazines, radio and television, the internet. If we goad editors into funding more of such work themselves, so much the better. But in any case, we aim to be part of improving the quality and the quantity of public debate on America's role in the world. You know, as we discussed this proposal last fall, we talked about how this perpetuated a type of journalism the Pulitzers had always supported. And I'm part of a long line of Post-Dispatch reporters sent out in the world. The Pulitzers didn't do it because reporting on Central America or Afghanistan or China added to circulation or brought in ads. I'm pretty sure that for the most part it did not. I believe they did it because they thought it was important and because they wanted to have a voice in debate on national policy and because they thought that their public, their readers, needed to know. It was pro bono journalism of a sort that even the best of newspaper chains, shackled to the demands of investors and quarterly returns, are unlikely to pursue. Our hope is that nonprofit journalism initiatives like the Pulitzer Center will continue that pro bono work in the years to come. I hope that institutions like the Stanley Foundation will also continue the important work that they do, giving people like me the opportunity to meet journalists from other regions and with different perspectives. A journalist like Habib Battah, who grew up in this country, but now is doing a great job helping us understand his homeland, Lebanon, and all of the Middle East. So now I'd like to turn it over to Habib, and then we can have discussion after.
You need to switch the mic.
Unattached, there you go.
I failed to let Mark know that there were two speakers, so that's
Put the
why
new
we're
inside or
doing
outside
this.
pocket?
Switching here.
I'd like to thank the Stanley Foundation also for having this opportunity to tell you guys what I can about Lebanon and the Middle East, which, well, today the topic was understanding the Middle East, but unfortunately I believe the media is doing a job of making us understand the Middle East less today. When I watch the TV in my hotel rooms for the past couple of days, I see the Middle East as basically a strategic map, and it has a big question mark over it, and that is, how do we stop these people from breeding terrorists? That seems to be the main concern. So this breeding ground seems to be, I mean, according to the news in America, one of the biggest threats out there to American citizens today. But you know, wait a second. Let's have a little perspective on this argument. 3,000 people were killed on September 11th, which is the biggest terrorist act probably in the last 10 years or ever. But actually, doing a little research from the FBI, and it seems to be a much bigger killer in America today that killed 8 times as many people as September 11th and does so every single year. Also, this evil force was responsible for 90,000 rapes and about 500,000 assaults. In total, there were 1.4 million violent crimes last year in America. So it makes me think about the coverage of this issue, which seems to be one of the biggest threats to Americans nowadays. All we hear about is the war on terrorism. What about the war on crime? The State Department today has a list of 26 countries that American citizens shouldn't go to, should be aware of, should have a low profile when they visit. And I ask myself the question, what's more dangerous? Visiting these 26 countries from Uzbekistan to Nepal, or staying home? I think the crime rate is a lot higher. So it's these kind of questions that I kind of wanted to pose to you and ask you to look at the media in a more critical way and to ask for more perspective and context in the coverage. And I'd like to just talk about a couple of quick events that happened recently that we saw heavy coverage in the American media, where I felt like there weren't really enough questions being asked and there wasn't any backgrounds. The Dubai port story, we've all heard a lot about it. And basically what we heard was what U.S. senators and congressmen were saying. And I could just recap a couple of those loud voices, such as New York Congressman Peter King, who said that al-Qaeda has such a strong presence in Dubai. And then we also had the other talking head was Mr. Menendez from New York, who said that Dubai has a serious and dubious history as a transit point for terrorism. Now, this is what I heard repeatedly. I mean, it was basically this argument versus, for some reason, we didn't understand why Bush was trying to defend this deal. But where was a Google search, at least, on Dubai? What is Dubai? I was in Dubai a couple of weeks ago. From my hotel room, I could see the tallest building in the world being built. Dubai has some of the biggest projects in the world. There are engineering feats that are going on. They're building islands in the sea. They're probably the most open country to business in the world. They have a no-tax policy. They're welcoming people from all over the world. And yet I watch a show called Scarborough Country on Fox. We get MSNBC in Lebanon, actually. And what we hear is that, okay, we're Republicans. We don't want to say that we can have foreign investments because we know that 60% of America's major ports have foreign interests. So we're just going to say that, well, a country like England can't be compared to, let's say, communist China. Did Joe Scarborough even go on the internet and find out that communist China has a big interest in California's ports? So, also, I mean, we hear all these travel warnings about Dubai and transit points of terrorism and staging grounds, when actually 100,000 British people live in Dubai. Did we even know that? Did we even ask that question? Why do 100,000 British people live in Dubai if it's such a terrible place? Quickly, let me go to the cartoon saga, which basically came out as also a very one-dimensional perspective of the Middle East, where we had to protect free speech. This was the narrative, that we were defending free speech at all costs. And that it was somehow justified for this Danish editor of a newspaper, to commission 25 or so cartoonists because he felt that picturing Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, was a taboo. So he decided to crush this taboo by having, oh, I'm sorry. I'm even worse than you guys. It's just a message. Okay. So basically, what we heard was this is protecting free speech, and this is actually helping our democracies. But then, a few weeks later, a British historian was arrested for 3 years in prison because of a speech that he gave. And this was a speech that was basically denying the Holocaust. So, in the interest of free speech, why didn't the Danish newspaper commission 25 cartoonists to ridicule the Holocaust? Was that just a completely different issue? Was that question even raised? Why was it okay to mock Islam at all costs, tens of people killed, but when it came to offending Jewish people, we had to self-censor ourselves in the interest of unbridled free speech, which is the argument that we heard was worth the death of all of these people across all of these countries. And lastly, I want to talk about Hamas. There was a recent press conference between Condoleezza Rice and the new Israeli foreign minister, who was being seen as a very critical player in Israeli politics. Kind of a young woman, very charismatic. And the argument was simple. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Israel cannot deal with terrorist organizations, especially if they don't recognize their own existence, Israel's existence, that is. So where is the questions? Where is the context? Who is saying this? Who is the person who is saying that I cannot deal with terrorists? Her father was the operations head of a group called the Irgun. The Irgun was a terrorist organization, according to the British authorities, that blew up the King David Hotel in the 1940s, killing 100 people, innocent people. We didn't hear that side of the story. What about Hamas recognizing Israel? You can't deal with someone who doesn't recognize you. Well, why didn't we zoom out for 5 years ago or 10 years ago when the word Palestinian never existed because Israel denied that the word existed? They denied they actually outlawed Palestinian flags. So here you have for 50 years, one side of the negotiating team is denying the other one. But when one day, when there's a party that's denying the other way around, we act like history didn't happen. So what I'd like to do is just ask you all to look into doing at least a Google search on some of these parties and seeing what they've said before. And that's what we're missing in the Middle East coverage. It's very one-dimensional. And I'll just like to say finally that I got a call from CNN a few weeks ago, and they were doing a story on Hamas having a TV channel. And so CNN thought this was a huge story. They had to devote a segment of their show International Correspondence to. And I wondered, well, why is CNN paying so much attention to the story when it didn't even really make any splash in the Arab press at all? Probably because it was just a small-time TV station. And in the broader context, it was one of 300 TV stations in the Middle East operating today. In the past 10 years, there's been an explosion of Arab TV channels. So it's not just Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya people are watching. They're also watching 40 or 50 music video channels. And if CNN was interested in knowing what Arab people really want to watch or what Arab young people watch, it would actually be reality TV and music videos. They're not watching Hamas. But then again, they still didn't do that search. They didn't do that little research to find out a better picture of reality. And I want to show you what Arabs are really watching, and it might surprise you. Is this the one here? This is American Idol in Arabic. The biggest rated show in the Middle East. What happened? Is it paused for some reason? Maybe you can help me. Sorry.
I think I know what we can do here. Okay, I think we need to probably just, if you show me which one it is, then we'll just
Look at that right there.
in here, which one is
Number one? Yes.
I think we need to just put it to the desktop.
Okay.
Is it already there?
By the way, these shows are people are voted off these shows or elected by telephone messages. And 30 million people voted for Superstar last episode, which was more than any Arab election ever. So you can see the priorities are not always political, just like here.
Which one was the other one? Is that the other one we wanted to show?
Yeah.
Okay, we gotta get this one.
Okay.
Here also. Sorry, let's.
There's also something going on. I'm going to show you a video. We have something called SMS messaging. I don't know how popular that is in America, but it's been very popular in the Middle East for a long time. I'll tell you about it in a second. When we... I don't know why it's not working. These guys didn't make it, by the way.
طلت سيبيعوا لك علوج سبقوني الحصادي هذا المنديل والمنفوش والحقني بيزوا لك علوج قوم يا علوج وان جبت منين هالجمال مش معقول نظرة عين قلبي مال على طول
ياي سحر عيونه ونظراته أول ما تلاقينا عين بعين ياي شو مهضومة كلماته تفتني كيف كانت نايم
أيام الحلوة انساها وريح
I said, should I kill myself? And then I just want to show you one of the music videos, just a little bit of it. Hopefully it won't be...
Just double click on it on the bottom left.
Okay. Sorry, the streaming is horrible. I don't know why. Put the volume down. I'll put the volume down a little bit. Here, everybody's sending messages. I love you. Here's my phone number. So there's kind of a on-screen dating that's going on. That's actually changed a lot of taboos in Saudi Arabia, for example. So we get the idea, basically. And the messages on the bottom, this is where all the money is in Arab TV today. 40 or 50 channels. It's the highest programming segment, the biggest growth segment in the Arab world today. And it's because these SMS messages are just millions of youth from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait are just dying to communicate with each other. And they're actually meeting people from Morocco or Tunis. And it's so bad that they have a whole team of censors that have to remove telephone numbers and email addresses. And so they try to do little covert messages by saying, I love you, I'll send you 2 flowers, 3 hearts. And so they kind of use poetry or whatever. They'll do anything to actually communicate. And that's what you're seeing today. So imagine 50 channels of that, and Hamas is kind of not even an issue. But CNN still thinks it is. That's it.
So, questions, comments?
Actually, this is kind of for both of you. I'm Steve with the journalism department. And I like the idea of what you described the Institute is doing. I agree with the need for that. But my concern is when the information is out there, how do we get the people to care if it's out there? Because everything that Habib told us about Dubai, I knew. Because I've found it on the New York Times and I hear it on NPR. So most Americans don't know it, they just hear the sound bites from the politician, but the information is there. It's in the New York Times, and it's on NPR. So my concern, I guess, John, is for those wanting to find the information that's there, how do we get people to
How do you engage people to pay attention? I think that's a very
And are you
important question.
addressing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that, are we close enough on this? Is that picking up? One of the things we hope to do with this Pulitzer Center, as an example, the first project, I will mostly be funding other projects, but I did do a reporting trip to Darfur in January, and I wrote about that for the Post-Dispatch. I also took a cameraman with me from Cairo, and we made a short video. We showed that on public television, and now we're making a longer version of that video, and I'm working with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and we're trying to use this Internet 2 technology. I'm not sure that SIU has it or not, but it's a fatter pipeline that's, you know, it's a lot of universities have signed up to, but it hasn't been used that much. But it gives you the ability to simulcast something to a virtually unlimited number of places. So we're working with lots of student groups around the country who are interested in Darfur. They want information about Darfur, and so we're taking this information, in this case, a 20-minute or so video, plus a panel discussion with people from the administration and activists from outside, and we're going to get it to, we hope, you know, several dozen university communities around the country. And So I think that kind of approach where you have the content, you go out and you do the reporting, and then you think a lot more about, you know, how do you get it to people who will be engaged and who you can engage through the material. I think that, you know, I know in my case at the Post-Dispatch over the years, and I did do a lot of projects overseas, but it tended to be just focused on the Post-Dispatch. We didn't do a lot of thinking about the aftermarket, after, you know, publication, promotion, and extension of that, and doing other things with it to encourage debate. And I think I'm hoping that we can show ways of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I usually get always the question, how does censorship affect your work? And it's true, we do have an issue of censorship. But when I come here and I watch TV and I see that the main stories are a cat falling out of a tree, or basically the Brad Jolina affair, which seems to be having a whole half an hour segment on Fox News, gets more time than any other big issue in the Middle East. The censorship that we face, people usually realize that when we can't say something, they kind of can go somewhere else and find it on the internet or whatever. The bigger problem than censorship, I think, is when you have market-driven news that is meant to shock and awe. And so when this shock and awe news takes up more space than anything else, I mean, celebrity news, I think, takes up much more analysis and live video feeds and interviews than does the Middle East conflict, or where your taxpayer money is going to support foreign military assistance for certain governments, keeping the world's largest prison, which is Palestine. So I think that actually it's a bit hypocritical sometimes to say that, you know, we are facing all of these problems when 80% of the news in America seems to be about celebrity news, sports, and weather. So I think that we need to take that into consideration.
This comment's more for Habib. Since we're talking about accuracy in news reporting, I think a clarification should be made in that actually in Israel, or if you want to call it Palestine, the British mandate, the Irgun's attack on the King David Hotel was actually not against innocent civilians. There was the British military, the British military officers, and it was the command central headquarters for the British military to base operations out of. And I think that's an important clarification distinction to make when reporting on such a...
Sure, I realized that it was still viewed as a terrorist organization.
You mentioned innocent civilians.
And there were innocent civilians killed as well. There were also British, there were not all military people that were killed. There were people it was actually the seat of the Palestine government, the mandate government. So there were a number of innocent people that were also killed in that attack. My point is not to turn it into a war between Israel and the British or whatever. It's just that the label of terrorist organization should be viewed in a more broader context. When someone is accusing someone of being a terrorist, you should know that the same government that's allied with America also considered that person's father a terrorist and the founding of that state as terrorists. So I'm not really saying anyone's better than anybody else. I'm just saying do a little research. It's pretty interesting.
And part of it is just, you know, our use and manipulation of words and the media. And I was thinking about back in 1993 when the Oslo process started, and it was first announced that the Clinton administration first disclosed that there had been these talks between the PLO and the Israelis. And I wrote a story. It was on the front page of the Post-Dispatch. I was in the Washington Bureau, and this is like a next day analysis story. And I said in the story that this was a major breakthrough and that it might lead to negotiations, it might go somewhere. But in the third or fourth paragraph, I said, on the front page, that one thing that's certain is that Arafat is the leader of a long designated terrorist organization. You won't ever see him on the White House lawn. And in fact, we saw him about 4 months later on the White House lawn shaking hands with Yitzhak Rabin, and he went on to be the person who visited the White House more than any other foreign leader during the course of the Clinton administration. But that's the mindset that we were all in, because we had been conditioned to think that. That's the way he was presented, just like Irgun was presented. And they then became the government of Israel, and the Palestinians then became people that you could negotiate with. And I'm quite certain that Hezbollah is going through that process now in Lebanon. They're understood as a legitimate political force in Lebanon. They're not understood that way in the United States as yet, but that's partly because our politicians manipulate the description of them, the depiction of them. The media tends to go along, so it's a problem.
Yeah, I would like to hear from both of you on this subject. What do you feel about the oppression of journalists? I've seen numerous instances of someone reporting something that may be politically unpopular with the neoconservative administration or the people that fund that organization. They're fired, threatened, this sort of thing. It seems like there's a trend towards toe the line and follow the dominant party line as opposed to doing real reporting. And that's my perception. So what do you think about that kind of trend?
I think it's a very dangerous trend, and that's I think it's one of the things that led us into the Iraq War. I think that our intelligence services, our think tanks on the left and the right, certainly the government, they all played a role in taking us into that war. But the media did not do the job it should have done, and you can begin with the best of the media, the New York Times and so on, that everybody was kind of cheerleading the war and not questioning things like the weapons of mass destruction, the role that the strength that Saddam Hussein had as of 2003, not 1987, 1991, but 2003. We just didn't do it. We didn't do the kind of critical reporting that we should have done, and it felt. There were periods from 9/11 attack until something like late 2003, 2004, that you just couldn't, there were things that you just couldn't get into a newspaper, that it was perceived as somehow unpatriotic if you challenged the thinking of the positions of the administration, and that's a terribly dangerous thing. It served us all very poorly.
I went to journalism school at the University of Texas, and I came out of there with the idea that the New York Times and the National Public Radio were among the best American journalism had to offer. That's why I was very shocked when I was in Beirut recently, and there was a major NPR reporter giving a talk in Beirut, and she kind of had this, it was a kind of a conference on media coverage of the Middle East, and she was saying that basically the coverage isn't very fair, and that we at NPR kind of are afraid to cover Palestinian issues in depth as we are to cover Israeli issues, because we're kind of afraid that there will be a divestment from donors that are of Jewish descent, and this has actually been threatened in the past. When I went to write the story about this, I got a frantic phone call from this, pious NPR free speech championing reporter telling me, please, 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 what did you write? I need to know what my quote was. And I said, I'm really shocked to hear this. This is NPR. And she said, no, I'm going to lose my job. You need to change the quote. I have talked to a number of journalists, also New York Times journalists. I even interviewed Dan Rather when he was in Beirut. And I've noticed that there's always a speech that I get when I'm talking to them on the record. But then afterwards, it's kind of like, well, I want to let you know that I really don't kind of believe that. And I found that among Dan Rather, a New York Times chief of bureau for the Middle East, and an NPR chief of bureau. So those are the top ones, and if that happens among them, it does happen with us too. I'm not trying to say that we're holier than thou. We definitely have our limits. There's always limits to press, and we have to realize that before we criticize other press systems.
It's about people losing their jobs, and maybe some of that could have been due to bad journalism, and that's fair.
Yeah.
But it seemed like that there was just exactly what you mentioned, that this is politically unpalatable. Right now, we don't like what you're saying, and you're out of here, that type of thing. I saw enough reports of that to where it just brought up a general concern. But I just kind of have an abstract concept of it. I don't really know any names at this point. So.
Well, I'm sorry, Walter.
Yeah, no, I'd like to go back to Habib's last comment, because I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend the commercial press in the United States, but I can't help but wonder if you're being a little disingenuous here in talking about the ability to get informed. At least in the United States, if you spend some time on the internet and you look at a variety of publications and watch a variety of television programs, you can get some reasonable sense of what's going on in the world. Would you say you can do that equally well in Syria or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or something like that?
It might surprise you. Actually, in the Middle East, we have access to satellite channels from all over the world. So you can either watch El Manar to get Hezbollah's propaganda, you can watch the Lebanese channels, you can watch Al Jazeera or Arabiya, you can also watch BBC World or CNN International, you can also watch Spanish news, you can watch German news, you can watch Asian news.
What you're saying here is that you can use the satellite to get outside. You're not defending the press systems of those particular countries, I take it.
Well, I'm just saying, my point is that every press system has its limitations, and I don't think it's really fair to compare and say this one is better than that one. We do have a broad choice of channels, and Americans have a broad choice too. The problem is how many Americans are actually going out and digging out those alternative media sources. I think most Americans are watching Fox, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, ABC News. And we were talking about this, that actually subscriptions are going down. There are internet resources, but I kind of want to, there's a difference in being marginalized and being censored. And at one point, they almost mean the same thing because people don't really care anymore. What they care about is the issues they're seeing on CNN, is the celebrity news. And I think that more Americans are concerned with Hollywood than Washington, D.C. Unfortunately so.
Could you talk a little bit about Syrian media or Egyptian media or Saudi Arabian media?
Yes, there are definitely limitations in every country. We do have Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, which are seen in every Arab country. What's happening now, you have to realize that in the Middle East, only in the last 10 years has the media begun to flourish. So it's kind of a still relatively new media. Pretty fast, 10 years ago we had 22 channels, approximately 22 mouthpieces. And as time has changed, now we have 300 channels. So it's only 10 years. You have to give them a little bit of time. You will find definitely state control in Saudi Arabia and Syria still, but doesn't mean they're not watching other alternatives like Al Jazeera and Arabiya, which they can all get into. It's a bit of a different concept. In America, every state is almost like a country. In the Middle East, countries are a lot smaller. So you don't always have to rely on what's happening in your country. I think that we have access to actually more information because we have access to all the European channels, the American channels, the kind of very militant channels in the Middle East, and the more subdued American-backed channels like Al Hurra.
My question is, both of you said it, and I think everybody will agree that the coverage in this country's media, particularly about Muslim or Islamic countries or issues, are very simplified and sometimes demonized. But my question is that, is this simplified and demonized representation is being seriously contested in Middle Eastern media? I know there are stereotypes about America and about American thing, but is there a serious discourse about it in Middle Eastern media? I don't know.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is that the coverage of Middle East, Islam or Muslims is very simplified, doesn't go to the complexities or nuanced understanding. But do you see any serious type of discourse in Middle Eastern media about it, about this problem? Yeah.
About its own stereotypes and
About its own
simplifications,
stereotypes,
about its own stereotypes about the United
yeah,
States,
yeah.
say. I don't think so. I think there's very little of that. I think we're each very good at seeing the problems on the other side and not paying much attention to our own, is my view.
Yeah, I think that we both have problems communicating, and that's why we try to have events like this to talk about it.
I had we were talking about the Danish cartoons earlier, and it was amazing to me, and all the coverage, there's a lot of coverage in January and February particularly about that incident and what had happened and the riots that took place, the embassies, there were consulates that were burned, people who were killed. And it wasn't until the middle of February, the New York Times had a op-ed piece by a Danish journalist. And he was criticizing his own countrymen, his own country, for its treatment of the 4 or 5% of the population in Denmark that's Muslim. And he just made reference to a couple of facts, and and I've been following this pretty closely, I think, and it was totally new to me. One was that Copenhagen had not permitted a single mosque to operate for 20 years in Copenhagen, even though you had 200,000 Muslims living in and around Copenhagen. And the other was that it's still the law in Denmark that there is no Muslim cemetery, so that if you are a devout Muslim and you want your loved one to be buried in an Islamic rite, that body has to be removed to another country. And that kind of treatment by the Saudi government of Jews and Christians is something that we've been very quick to write about and criticize. And And yet it wasn't even it wasn't really on the table. People were talking about how could they get so upset about a thing like free speech and just silly cartoons, but there was all this stuff behind it, as Habib was saying.
Quick question, which I asked him. I pick up on the question that the gentleman brought in a few minutes ago about the media covering something in depth. What you mentioned about the cartoons is now 2-3 months since they appeared. Could somebody, a religious leader or the media, have picked up on this in a different way now that things have subsided a little bit and say, do we want, this is not what Islam is about, and this is the perception of people, how they're perceiving the Prophet, and that's not what it's about, and why are we annoyed about it? Because all of these events that are happening, the insurgents, are making people think that this is what Islam about, and it isn't. Could something like this have developed as a series of articles to really, and perhaps I can say religious Islamic people who really have respect, whom people respect, both in the Islamic world and abroad and outside of it. Could they not have been a discussion of this? Couldn't the media have picked up on something like this? This is not what Islam is about. And the reason we are annoyed about this is because of what it projects. And if the insurgents did not kill innocent lives and didn't do this, this is the concept. In the same way as you said, we don't understand the Middle East, and I've lived there, lived in Lebanon and in Egypt, in Syria, and I know it isn't. Why couldn't the media pick up on something like this instead of, and then someone criticize from the West here and say, why are newspapers covering, our TVs covering a murder that's happened, or the incidents that have made headlines, when we should be really dealing with questions like this, both in the Middle East and here. Do you see this developing as something that somebody could pick up, a very respectable journalist? But in Islamic leaders are really people who could object to this and make their followers realize that that's not what we want to project, and that's what the events are projecting. I don't know if I'm getting it clear or not, because...
Well, I think there were bits and pieces of that was reported, not nearly enough. And I think part of it is the bias, the media bias is always toward conflict, confrontation. And so that and the simplification, so that it's freedom versus repression, it's civilization versus, forces against progress. And it's just, that's, we simplify by nature, and that's what we have to, you have to sort of consciously work against it.
The cartoon riots were actually very political as well. That was kind of missed by the international media. They saw it as like a big package. Basically, this is kind of animalistic behavior by radical Muslims. But there's also a whole element of these regimes and supporting this radical Islam and kind of having a difficult marriage with it, such like the Egyptian government. And it was really astonishing to see these governments allow these things to happen in societies like Syria, for example. And Lebanon was very political. In Nigeria, it was political between Christians. It was a long. This was kind of part of a bigger dispute in every country. So we kind of did oversimplify it, and more reporting would be appreciated.
Well, one last question.
I have a thesis which I'd like to have you respond to. It took a Richard Nixon for the United States to have a rapprochement with China. I am wondering if it would take a Hamas to have a rapprochement to Israel.
I think so. That's sort of my view of it. I may be wrong.
That we may be making a mistake in trying to isolate them. Maybe give them a chance.
Yeah, I think we have to look at why they were elected in the first place. I mean, they weren't.
PLO is never going to make a rapprochement with Israel and make it stick. I mean, they can pretend to do it, but Hamas will undercut it. But if Hamas does it, it might stick. That's my thesis here, anyhow. And would you agree with that?
I certainly hope so. I mean, at least now, Israel is dealing with the forces that they said Arafat couldn't control. So at least maybe there might be more accountability now on the table.
And perhaps a force that has more credibility among the great majority of Palestinian people, just because of the PLO was Fatah was so identified with corruption in recent years, and they hadn't delivered. I mean, the Palestinians are aware of a lot of aid money that was coming in that was it didn't get to anybody. It just went to party officials, and Hamas seized on that.
Okay,
Same way Hezbollah did.
We've got to bring it to an end. Thanks you all for coming. Thanks, John.
Thank you all.